Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I believe that the discussion of sanctions, unilateral sanctions, and the impact on the enjoyment of human rights is very timely in every part of the globe today. Unfortunately, today the world community is facing the expanding number, scope, types, means of unilateral sanctions applied by states or regional organizations without or beyond authorization of the UN Security Council. The number of these sanctions is expanding today. We can speak, for example, about the economic sanctions, trade embargoes, financial sanctions, or sectoral sanctions, which is affecting the whole spectrum of economy in the targeted countries. We speak today about sanctions applied to specific individuals or companies, so-called targeted sanctions. We started to discuss secondary sanctions, which are imposed against individuals or companies for violations, so-called violations, or any attempts to subvert or circumvent the existing sanctions regime. At the same time, when we try to identify today what unilateral sanctions are, we shouldn't forget the means of implementation or enforcement. For example, imposition of criminal or civil charges over companies or individuals which do not follow the requirements of unilateral sanctions imposed without or beyond authorization of the UN Security Council. That's why in the existing situation it's so complicated to identify what we're talking about when we are discussing sanctions. At the same time, it's necessary to remember that any unilateral measures can only be used by states or regional organizations in the situations when the authorization of the UN Security Council exists, or measures taken do not violate any international obligation of a state or regional organization which apply these sanctions, or if, for example, application of these unilateral sanctions correspond the requirements of the law of international responsibility, in particular the law of countermeasures. That means they are taken in response to pre-existed violation of international obligation. They are necessary proportionally to the violation committed, and moreover, they are not affecting human rights, erga omnes obligations, or international humanitarian law. Unfortunately, today, the majority of unilateral sanctions imposed without or beyond authorization of the UN Security Council do not correspond to these criteria, and therefore they are illegal from the point of international law and can be qualified as unilateral coercive measures. Another problem beyond the expansion of illegal unilateral sanctions, we can speak about the absence of assessment of the humanitarian impact which is done by application of these sanctions. It's necessary to mention that unlike at the humanitarian assessment of sanctions imposed by the UN Security Council, which are legal, done in 1990s and 2000, no humanitarian impact of unilateral sanctions is usually taken today. That's only my mandate and some efforts taken by counterterrorism, assessment of counterterrorism measures, and the Office of High Commissioner, which seek to identify what can be qualified as the unilateral sanctions today, and secondly, what is the humanitarian impact. And that's one of the problems we have to face. Unfortunately, it's necessary to admit today that nearly all categories of human rights, in particular civil rights, economic, social, cultural rights, as well as collective rights, like for example the right to development, are affected today by application of unilateral coercive measures. Naturally, the direct effect of economic, financial, or trade sanctions, as well as sanctions which are imposed against sectors of economy of specific country, is the most obvious and direct. Generally speaking, it affects directly the whole population of the country as such, take into account that in accordance to information received both from countries, individuals, as well as members of humanitarian organizations, existing humanitarian exceptions mechanisms are traditionally ineffective and quite often they can't be realized, and naturally they are insufficient. As a result of application of sanctions against the country as a whole, specific sectors of economy, or imposing economic trade or financial sanction, each individual in the specific country is affected. That basically means that countries are unable to buy goods necessary to support the normal functioning of the society. It started to be especially clear, for example, in the period of COVID-19, when countries under sanctions were unable to buy medicine necessary to prevent this COVID, as well as to provide necessary treatment to its population, tests, vaccines, and so forth. As for now, for example, vaccination is still an open question. For example, recently there was a huge discussion and whether Venezuela, for example, is able to transfer money to be able to benefit from COVAX process. At the same time, situation is not limited to medicine and food only, although unfortunately the problem of availability of medical goods as well as of food is a very serious one. COVID is not the only situation or is not the only problem which is faced by the countries. Quite often countries are not able to guarantee necessary medical treatment for patients who are in need of that. For example, who need transplantation or who need some sort of equipment to support their daily life, or who need some specific medicine, as for example, people who are suffering from hepatitis or from diabetes, and they are in need of constant insulin injections, and as well as many other diseases. Unfortunately, application of these sorts of sanctions is impeding the ability of countries to buy equipment and spare parts for maintenance of the necessary essential infrastructure, like electricity, water supply, internet provision, the gasoline provision, gas, and so forth. As a result, transportation of the country is suffering. People are unable to get sufficient clear water as well as sanitation. They start using open firewoods, which endanger the environment and endanger the possibility, their life as well. And moreover, it destroys the forests all around the places where people live. Moreover, people, because of the same measures, children are often prevented of getting possibility to get education, because it's a problem for them to get to the school, to be taught. Moreover, in the COVID situation, when the majority of countries started to teach online, impossibility to get normal access to internet because impediments of functioning of electricity system, or impediments in getting access and concluding agreements about satellite access, provide these children no chance to get the possibility for online studies. The same situation concerns all other critical infrastructure in the country, because countries are not just able to maintain the necessary critical infrastructure for a period when sanctions are applied. As a result, unfortunately, besides these sectoral sanctions as well as economic, financial, and trade sanctions, this situation is aggravated by application of a huge number of so-called targeted sanctions, which are officially announced to be very restricted and to target, let's say, as they say, only those who are guilty for doing something. It's necessary to mention, first of all, that if one looks at the grounds for introduction of targeted sanctions, quite often the grounds for their introduction couldn't be qualified as a specific crime at all. In some other situation, even if any allegation that a crime has been committed exists, there is no jurisdiction for imposing any penalties over a specific individual. And that's why all these measures in practice violate the right to fair trial as well as the presumption of innocence. In quite a lot of situations, individuals targeted by targeted sanctions can't get access to justice to prove that they are not guilty in a specific case. It's necessary to mention that this possibility exists as regards, for example, sanctions imposed by the European Union, but doesn't exist as concerns the US sanctions. And as a result, beside the rights which have already been affected for the population as such, these individuals can't get access to justice and can't get any fair trial guarantees. In practice, however, application of unilateral sanctions, both economic, sectoral, and targeted, is enforced by application of so-called secondary sanctions for violation of sanctions regime. And as a result, people are scared to get in contact, or they are scared to communicate to any individual or a company from the targeted society, even if they are not listed at all, because of the fear to fall under secondary sanctions, or because of the fear to face criminal or civil charges under the jurisdiction of a country of their nationality. All this results in the enormous overcompliance with officially imposed sanctions regime, and it's possible to see it on the example of banks. After one of the banks has been fined for a sum for up to several $1 billion, all the other banks prefer not to deal with the society to which sanctions are imposed in one way or another. It's necessary to mention that as a result of application of unilateral sanctions today, nearly all human rights are affected. I will mention here the right to health, because no access to necessary medical equipment is possible and medical aid is possible. Right to food, right to education, right to decent life, right to decent work, all economic, social, and cultural guarantee. Quite often freedom of expression, because impossibility to register for international communication platforms and use those online services which are publicly provided free of charge to everyone or for certain payment for everyone. Individuals, nationals of specific countries can't benefit from this. Right to education, access to information, and as a result, unfortunately, quite often the right to life is also affected. Due to the same situation, we can speak about violation of the right to development for the population of the countries as such, because traditionally, when sanctions are comprehensively imposed, economic situation in countries is deteriorating a lot, and that basically means that countries have to spend money to provide basic needs of the population rather than to develop and to focus on achieving the sustainable development goals. It's also necessary to mention that besides all these people, there are a number of indirect sanctions, indirectly sanctioned individuals. We speak about workers of the targeted companies. We speak about the workers and owners of private businesses who haven't been targeted, but who is not able to be involved in the normal business. We speak about business partners, family members, humanitarian organizations which are targeted for trying to do their humanitarian job and to deliver humanitarian aid. That's why it's so important today to qualify every individual measure taken at the international area from the point of international law. It's necessary to use so-called precautionary principle to do a legal assessment as well as humanitarian assessment before any measure is taken by any state or regional organization. Secondly, it's necessary to ensure that every measure taken by any state or regional organization corresponds its international obligations and, moreover, doesn't affect the population of the country, because human rights of every individual all around the world is important. Comprehensive humanitarian assessment is necessary. And that's why, upon my opinion, it's so important that all international organizations all around the world are involved in the assessment of impact of unilateral sanctions on the enjoyment of human rights from their personal perspective, as for example from the point of labor rights, or rights of children, rights of women, of other categories of people who are affected a lot, like women, children, people suffering from chronic diseases or any other sorts of diseases. Only in this situation, if the world community will be able to ensure the rule of law in interstate relations, it will be possible to guarantee that human rights are not affected. Thank you for your attention.